billions of dollars
Sorry.
of funding for fossil fuel extraction. You can email me or Rich Hammond if you'd like more information about that. On Friday, April 22nd, we're having a speaker at our Shabbat services. We'll discuss the National Wildlife Habitat Certification for our temple building, for your yard and your community. And we're having a spring kickoff for our pollinator garden on May 28th. We first approached the Jewish Youth Climate Movement to speak a couple months ago, and I was really interested in hearing from the younger generation, get inspired to help address the climate crisis. A lot has happened since then. I think a lot of our minds are on Ukraine and Putin's invasion there that's unleashed a humanitarian catastrophe, and his missiles and bombs that are being dropped on hospitals, apartment buildings, and crowds of civilians are paid for by the world's dependence of fossil fuels. So I really feel we're at this inflection point where climate and just the ethics and geopolitics are all coming together, and it's time to make a change. So I like to look at things as possibilities and solutions, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change just released their most recent report that says we have the tools we need to avert the worst, but what's really missing now is just the initiative and political will to make it happen. And my hope here lies with groups like the Jewish Youth Climate Movement. And tonight we have the pleasure of hearing from Sarah Gorbatov and Maya Kendall, and they're going to discuss the Jewish climate narrative. This program investigates how the climate crisis is particularly a Jewish question, an issue rooted in our history and outlook. And they'll touch on how Jews have responded to climate urgency in the past and must continue to make it a priority. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah and Maya. Thanks again for coming.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this presentation. I'm really excited to learn with you all. So I'm Sarah. I'm a senior in high school located in northern New Jersey, just outside of New York City. And I am the education director at the Jewish Youth Climate Movement. So these sorts of learning gatherings are definitely a constant in my life, and I enjoy them very much. I'm also in the policy working group. I'm in the songwriting initiative, and I previously served as our Shemitah campaign co-captain. So if you have any questions about any of those roles, or starting a kibbutza, or JYCM in general, please feel free to ask them. I would be happy to answer. So Maya, if you could share a screen if you're able to, I can begin the presentation.
For some reason, it is not letting me share my screen, and I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why it's not letting me. It's not giving me the option to share my screen. It's only giving me the option to share certain apps, which has never happened before. So I can share the link with you, Rabbi, if that's okay, if you can share your screen.
Try once more. I think I just switched something, so maybe you can share now.
Let's see. It is still not working for some reason. I'm so sorry. This is technical difficulties have to come with every Zoom meeting.
Okay.
I can attempt to share my screen, see if that works.
That would be great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay. Can you guys see
Yes.
the presentation? Yes.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
So today we are going to be talking about the Jewish climate narrative. And those three words at first sight can seem to be somewhat disconnected, right? Jewish climate narrative. But over the course of the presentation, we will attempt to combine them. And for now, we're going to talk specifically about the narrative component. So the word narrative signifies that there's an element of impactful storytelling, and that storytelling is in our hands as Jews and as climate activists. And so what we're going to do today is rethink how we can tell the story of the climate crisis as the Jewish people and as a Jewish movement fighting against the crisis. So I'm going to pose a question to you all, which is on the screen. What Jewish texts and stories come to mind when you think about the climate crisis? And feel free to raise your hand. I guess that would be most organized, and then we can get a discussion going. To start us off, I think what comes to mind for me is definitely Noah's Ark and the flood. And in the wake of that flood, the dove and the olive branch and the symbolism of that entire story. And it can be a biblical story, and it can also be a practice. So I mentioned the Shemitah campaign that JYCM had. Shemitah, we used it as a biblical reference point for one of our campaigns, the year-long land sabbatical. And we basically made this list of 7 commitments that Jewish institutions, like your synagogue, for example, your synagogues, could sign on to demonstrate your interest in mobilizing against the climate crisis. So are there any other stories or practices like Noah's Ark and the flood and Shemitah that come to mind when you think about the climate crisis?
What about the famine in this, in the story of what's it, Dream Coat?
Oh, the famine and Joseph.
The famine in Joseph.
Dry years and just what happened, the dry and that was the dry years and the years, the drought.
Yeah.
The drought.
So that experience of preparing for a better day, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really good example. I think also just more fundamentally creation, the story of creation, the sun, the plants, the animals. In Deuteronomy, the concept of Bal Tashchit, of not destroying our environment, no matter, what the stakes are, no matter, what we're being offered. And the power of water as a symbol, exemplified by Miriam and the wells and mikvah, everything of that sort in Judaism. And also just Tu B'Shvat and Sukkot and the lulav and the etrog and the 7 species of plants. So there's a lot going on in Judaism in terms of connection to the environment and the greenery surrounding us, as well as the climate crisis. And you can put more suggestions in the chat. Yeah, Noah, exactly. So the story I want to refer to tonight is one you probably didn't think of when I asked you to reflect on the stories and texts in Judaism related to the climate crisis. And that is Brit, the concept of Brit and the Brit between God and the Jewish people. Does anybody want to define that term Brit for us?
Oh, it's up there.
I'll throw out contract,
Yeah, that's a nice legal one. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think contract, agreement, oath, promise, covenant is the one that's most commonly used. So what we're going to be talking about today is this generational covenant, this promise between the Jewish people and God. God establishes his, that's the textual pronoun that I'll use, connection to the Jewish people through the covenant, the promise, the oath, the agreement. And this is passed down from our forefathers, from Abraham to Isaac to Yaakov, to the tribes, and all the way down to us as Jews today. And there's this text from Bereshit that I'll read quickly. I now establish my covenant with you and your offspring to come, and with every living thing that is with you, birds, cattle, and every wild beast as well, all that have come out of the ark, every living thing on earth. I will maintain my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth for all ages to come, right? This brit was made in the wake of Noah's Ark and the flood and the story that we were referencing earlier. And I've bolded some important terms here, some key phrases. You and your offspring, maintain my covenant for all ages to come. All of these relate to the idea of continuity, of passing down tradition. And in my perspective, the central sociological idea of Jewish continuity is born from this covenant, this endowed responsibility to have children, literally, and more figuratively, to build a community. And that's basically the main moral of tonight. Our climate story is a generational story. Lador vador, from generation to generation, we pass down this covenant. We pass the brit to our children, the values to their children, and the traditions, the Jewish calendar, the rituals, and the community to our children's children's children. We lived through the worst of the worst because We clung to our culture of an earth-based existence, of lighting the candles on Shabbat, of building Sukkot on Sukkot, of eating the 7 species. We protected the culture, and the culture in turn protected us, right? There's that famous Achad Ha'am quote, more than the Jews have kept Shabbat, Shabbat has kept the Jews. What we observe spiritually and culturally as a people is what binds us together and inspires us to thrive. Our culture provides the dream of Lador Vador, of survival and continuity as first envisioned by the covenant between God and the Jewish people. So everything about Jewish presence came down to surviving to the next generation. Survival of culture, survival of people, survival of communities and individuals whose lives were in immediate peril. And I want to pose another question to all of you. When and where were we threatened? What are some examples of Jewish tragedies throughout history that mean something really impactful for you? Feel free to shout them out this time.
So the destruction of the temples.
Yeah.
I could go on and on, but I'm the rabbi here, so somebody else jump in.
The story of Haman and the Jews to be all killed.
Yep.
Could you repeat the question, please? I'm sorry.
Yeah, of course. The question is, what are some examples of Jewish tragedies, for example, genocides, throughout history?
Inquisition.
Say it, you're on mute.
The Inquisition.
Yeah, the Spanish Inquisition, yeah. So all of these are great examples: the destruction of the Second Temple, the Spanish Inquisition, the expulsion and forced conversion of Sephardic Jews from Spain and Portugal, Megillat Esther, and pogroms in the USSR, the Holocaust, obviously the Nuremberg race laws, the Final Solution, the concentration camps, blood libel during the medieval era and the Crusades. Modern day anti-Semitism also, right, because anti-Semitism is a living, breathing form of vile hatred, unfortunately. Recently, the Colleyville hostage situation, that definitely grabbed the media's attention. So in the diaspora, as all of these horrific tragedies represent, we ran and we resettled and we internalized and we viewed everything that came our way as a Jewish question of how to preserve our existence. Wherever we went, we combined that embodied memory of trauma and that innate desire to survive against all odds with the beauty of tradition. And these two, tradition and survival, have marched alongside one another as we have ran and resettled since the beginning of Jewish history 5,782 years ago. They have always coexisted and they are inseparable because survival, it feeds off of tradition and tradition depends on survival. So today, the world defines the climate crisis as the greatest existential threat of our time. The consequences are definitely terrifying. A 6th mass extinction is ensuing, and unmitigated, the results will be catastrophic. We are in a fight for the very survival of the planet as we know it, for the very survival of all peoples, of all communities, of all cultures and heritages, and that includes the Jewish people. The climate crisis puts everything we have built as a society at stake. There's this really cool ecofeminist book called All We Can Save, and it discusses the loss of life and lifestyle that would be a result of the climate crisis. And of course, as Jews, we would bear the brunt of that. People are in this fight because it's about who they are and how they got here. The climate crisis involves all kinds of histories, all kinds of communities, immigration stories, civilizations, traumas, traditions, wonders, and horrors. People that have been traumatized by systemic powers, and during times of peril, like global warming, as well as the situation in Ukraine, are re-traumatized. The gravity of this moment is one that we as Jews understand far too well. While the world panics and scrambles, we can practice as a people introspection. Our history is one of protecting our individual tradition and surviving in a world greater than ourselves. We are phenomenal survivalists. We take existential threats incredibly seriously. And the climate crisis is the existential challenge we are here to combat tonight during this gathering and afterward. So on this slide, you'll see our grisly future. Floods, polluted air, and wildfires that contradict God's brit, the covenant that promised no natural disasters after the flood. These disasters are happening at an accelerated rate, And soon, if no big and bold solutions are implemented, they will change what it means to be a person, to be a professional, to be a traveler, and of course, to be a Jew. On this slide, there are flooded synagogues, people carrying disintegrated Torahs, and Sukkot crumbling. How are we supposed to move forward with our traditions if this existential crisis, the climate crisis, is weighing on us and preventing us from performing our rituals? This is unfortunately what we have to look forward to if no change is taken. Thousands of years of a vibrant tradition and text unraveled and laid limp, colorless, bleeding out before our eyes. The following 2 slides are an excerpt from an essay that JYCM Leadership Board members, founding Leadership Board members, wrote last year for the Peoplehood Papers. Would someone like to read these aloud to everyone? No? Okay, I can read them. A little difficult to see who's raising their hands and who's not. So, JCC is aflame during uncontrollable wildfires. Jewish neighborhoods uprooted and scattered in the wake of hurricanes. Wet ink smearing the pages of Torah scrolls waterlogged during floods. We can already witness these tragic scenes playing out on the global stage today. And what's next? Sukkot spent within the colorless walls of a barren sukkah, praying for fresh produce and the end of a drought that seems permanent. Passover gathered around a Seder plate of leafy greens wilted in a suffocating heat wave while we recite the plagues of old. Tisha B'Av observed in mourning of all the synagogues assailed by the commonplace disasters characteristic of the worsening climate condition. Continues, these are the images of a dying world. Our community will suffer future catastrophes in unending multitudes. Our holidays will lack their seasonal significance. Our traditions will morph into the unrecognizable. This is the great existential threat of our era. Jews have weathered many an oppressive storm before, and we are adept survivalists. We must reinvigorate our environmental tradition to demonstrate the weight of Lador Vador by rising up collectively against the climate crisis. Those who come after us deserve the richness of a culture Jews have maintained and cherished for millennia. So just as a fun fact, maybe not so fun, it takes 70 years to grow a carob tree, a tree vital to Jewish symbolism and practice, and it takes minutes to chop one down. Entire enclaves, with all their sources and facets of living, were carefully cultivated over centuries and are being brought down at unthinkable speeds. An unraveling of progress, an extinguishing of life. If climate change poses the largest modern existential threat to humanity, and our Jewish community tends to approach the millennia-old question of Jewish preservation as a reckoning with our people's universalist and particularist projects, the Jewish Youth Climate Movement's response to the climate crisis lies at the intersection of these 2 elements. Just another link in the chain of traditional mobilization to preserve and improve all existence. Essentially, in short, we must act not because of tikkun olam necessarily, but because of who we are, what we have survived, and what we are not willing to give up. Trauma begets trauma. Jews have understood this for centuries. At this point in the climate crisis, we know that traumatic suffering is in store for frontline communities, particularly those communities grappling with historic trauma. So combating the climate crisis is not just about Jewish values, quote unquote. It is about Jewish experience and Jewish history. It is about all those generations of mythic proportions who struggled under oppression and lived on for the sake of their children. It is about young Jews growing up in a traumatized generation, struggling under the normalized fear of mass shootings, political polarization, a struggling economy, systemic racism and inequality, and of course, a climate crisis that makes our entire future uncertain. This one crisis involves and causes so many community issues like anti-Semitism. Intergenerational trauma makes Jews more susceptible to the pain of migration and uprooting ourselves. The emotional toll of the climate crisis cannot be understated. We know this will hurt. We know it will ache. We will draw up the unreconciled pain of the past and force our children to grow up in a world where their future hangs in the balance. Jews before us fought with every fiber of their being for their children to grow in safety. Now, that dream is in jeopardy for the Jewish youth of today and for those who come after us. Is it safe to continue the Brit, to continue the covenant? Will it be too dangerous, too reckless to bring children into a world gripped by climate upheaval? Being Jewish throughout the generations meant that community, life, Jewishness, it all held tremendous weight because anti-Semitism and oppression made continuity feel questionable. We didn't dare take permanence for granted. But in recent decades, we have begun to do just that. After the Holocaust brought a global reckoning with anti-Semitism, the founding of the State of Israel, and Jews integrated into American society, global Jewry felt really secure. We've assimilated into an industrial society that abuses the earth, feeling powerful in what seemed the end of anti-Semitism, permanent acceptance into the world as strong Jews. We saw our longevity as a given fact of having come this far, not something we needed to fight for on a daily basis to protect ourselves and each other. But recent years have exposed the naivety of this mindset of taking survival for granted. Anti-Semitism is steadily on the rise worldwide, and Jews everywhere are rightfully afraid. Age-old hatred has continued to fester, turning deadly and heartbreaking ways for our community. And at the same time, the climate crisis has already begun to take thousands of lives annually, displacing thousands more. So these crises are occurring simultaneously. Humanity is grappling with its own mortality, mass death looming if we continue on this trajectory. And political research and trends indicate that climate change will dissolve the current world order into a conflict that only greater divides the people of this earth. That seeks to elevate white supremacist fascist forces and threatens all our lives. As Jews, our lives are dually threatened by these two compounding crises. We cannot continue to make the mistake we've been making. We can no longer take our survival and our permanence for granted. Now, given everything we've discussed, it's very understandable to feel overwhelmed, bewildered, anxious, scared for ourselves and for our children, but we can seize this opportunity. We cannot allow the climate crisis to cause the level of death and destruction that it very well might if we do nothing, if we sit by the sidelines. Our children deserve to live their lives with the beauty and the richness of our Jewish culture and tradition, and with the strength of a multicultural world where all people can achieve liberation and thrive. Instead of allowing our passivity to continue to drown and burn our communities, to jeopardize our calendar and land-based culture and the lives of our sister communities across the globe, let us view this as an opportunity for a great revival of culture and for a reshaping of the Jewish climate narrative. Those three words are coming together, the Jewish climate narrative. Assimilation has taught us to care more about money and about not rocking the boat than about celebrating the teachings of our culture, about protecting the land we live on. Believing in the crisis and supporting action, however, is not enough. We must be the ones who take action collectively in the spirit of Jewish tradition and a desire for universal social justice. By pairing our two motivations together, Judaism and climate activism, we can revive elements of the justice-oriented environmental culture we have lost to assimilation, trauma, and our modern world. By implementing institutional climate action plans, by taking to the streets en masse, by teaching our community members as youth, by building kivutzot, we can see this not as a threat, but as an opportunity. We can make these next years the best of times as opposed to the worst of times. My hope, my prayer is that we weave collective action for the climate into the fabric of what it means to be a Jew in the modern world. At Passover upcoming, we see that every generation, they, the enemy, rose up against us. This time, bad actors in industry and those in power have risen up against us again, especially in the fossil fuel industry, those who created the crisis. But just like in every other generation, we will rise up together in defense of human life. We will avert the worst of this crisis, and we will continue our cultural tradition and our climate narrative. So that's all I have in terms of presentation, and I was hoping at this point we could go into breakout rooms for a short while and think about, brainstorm moments in our lives that have struck us in terms of the severity of the climate crisis. You can think about how old were you, context were you in, what was your upbringing, and how did it influence your understanding of this event, and what did you feel in that moment? And we have a pretty small group, actually, so maybe we could do this without breakout rooms, and then we could come back and share what we are thinking. And then we'll do a little bit of writing and journaling in response to our brainstorming. So the prompt, I can put it in the chat so I don't have to screen share, is to just brainstorm instances in your life that have caused you to take note of the climate crisis. I can share a little bit to get you guys thinking. So I'm someone who has moved around a lot over the course of my 16 years of life. I was born in California, and there I experienced wildfires. And then when I was about 2, I moved to Nebraska, and there I experienced tornadoes, and I had to hide under the staircase in our tornado shelter quite often. And then I moved to New Jersey, and in 2012, there was Hurricane Sandy, and our power was shut off, and our basement flooded, and I couldn't go to school. And so basically, everywhere I've been, this crisis and its various manifestations of natural disaster has followed me. And so observing this at such a young age has compelled me to, for example, join the Jewish Youth Climate Movement and start educating others about the crisis and how it affects us on an individual level and how we can take collective action to combat it. So maybe instances like that, or maybe you read an article or watched a movie or someone dear to you spoke about an experience they had. What's one moment or couple moments that inspired you to think in this way? And we can take 10 minutes to just reflect, maybe write something down.
Well, I could just share something. I mean, I've lived in the Midwest for most of my life, and fortunately, climatically, we're in a pretty good spot in northern Illinois. But I think as I've learned about the climate crisis, one sort of image or representation that really has struck with me is when there's a showing of the planet. Well, a couple things. So there's the thin blue line, which is a famous picture taken from the moon looking back at the Earth, which shows just how thin the atmosphere is and how Earth is just all alone in the blackness of space. And you really realize like that's what we're using as our garbage dump, is that thin layer of atmosphere that's there. And then another is a picture of the Earth, like a satellite image that shows average temperature over the last 100 years. And there's blue and then there's red, and year by year the whole Earth just gets swallowed up with red. And I think that was a kind of an image or series of images that really kind of struck home, more so than a graph or news stories, I guess, because we haven't really had too much impact, I guess, here, other than longer heat waves and some drier years, but nothing like Superstorm Sandy or forest fires, crop failures, things of that nature.
I grew up in Florida, and went through a lot of hurricanes when I was a kid. But those were normal hurricanes, and it was you prepared for the hurricane, and after the hurricane, you came out of your house and you cleaned up, the debris, right? But it wasn't like it is now. And so when the hurricane hit New Orleans, and then a couple of years, and I went down and helped with some cleanup and some rebuilding efforts down there, and just seeing the difference and recognizing that how much the natural, because of the rise of sea level, the natural barriers to the hurricanes in New Orleans were gone. And so what, when I was a kid, would have just sort of gone through and been a kind of a regular hurricane has become something much worse, and that really made it very clear. Yes.
So I think that there's a common conception that people on the coasts they have a more drastic experience, and that maybe we don't have that. And I've never lived through any, really some that burst storm where the trees all fell down, but I don't know that that's related. But I just always felt that it was nature that was the divine offering, and that it was always something in nature. And so I think it just always grew out of that. It's like a snowball, though. So my whole life moving to this, it's everything. Watching a polar bear barely on a piece of ice is heartbreaking. It doesn't have to be in my yard. There's enough problems in my yard. I feel very connected to every single thing, and it's a web of life, and so it's really everything.
I'm not sure that there's one event that triggered it. I mean, like the rabbi said, and Jay, it sort of evolved, where things progressively got worse and got worse and got hotter here. And then then the awareness just kicked in with, the different opportunities to hear about it, be it, probably starting 10 years ago is when it really started hitting home. But there was a slow evolution that we were not aware of. And then as these things hit home, the once in a lifetime storms that happen every year now and all that other stuff.
I was just teaching in our teen class. And I was gonna say that, we were talking about the history of Earth Day, and that, in 1970, people were talking about this stuff. And it's taken so long for it to become real to us.
When we're having these 100-year storms happening every other year has been it got my attention. The wildfires in California wiping out entire towns got my attention. Greta Thunberg, leading a global movement made me, brought to my attention the generational aspect of this, and made it much more important to me to be thinking about the future.
Well, we have a lot of friends and family in California, and just the constant worry about the drought and rationing their water, and then there's fires and also Boston. I mean, they used to every once in a while have a snowstorm. Now it's every year they have these horrendous snows. It's like, I don't know if Andy said the coasts, but like it's almost like, people are going to be moving into the central of the states because the coasts are very, unstable sometimes, or feel unstable. And the people who live there, I think it's a little bit quality of life that you're always waiting for the next disaster.
And that's far, far worse the closer you go to the equator, in the more in the less affluent countries. They have a lot less ability to deal with these problems.
Thank you all for sharing. That was really incredible. I didn't even have to facilitate. You guys just took it away. You made so many great points. Really, the point about how sometimes an image of a horrific event can say so much more than a graph or a statistic, particularly if you haven't experienced the horrific event. And then being on the other side, experiencing and feeling called to action, or hearing about loved ones who have had those experiences and wanting to protect them. So thank you so much for sharing everything you did. I was wondering, we have a few more minutes to discuss. Did any of the points that were made about the confluence of Judaism and the climate crisis resonate with you? And have you ever experienced that feeling? And perhaps how can we take advantage of that confluence, if you think it exists, to end the climate crisis?
And when you said something about our seasonal holidays not being connected to a season anymore, that struck home for me. I hadn't really thought about it that way. The what do we do when Sukkot is not a fall harvest moment anymore? Sorry about the dog.
I always think of, and there will be none to come after. That's just my watchword as I watch what we do.
I think I do like that connection with thinking about, at moments in our past, how perilous and fragile our very survival was. Like you said, we've the people, we've been through this many times throughout the world, and the larger world is going through the same thing, whether they realize it now or not. I think that's a very strong connection that you make.
Yeah, I think one point to add also that I didn't mention in the presentation is that anti-Semitism in its worst form is very obvious. It's very tangible in all of the manifestations that we mentioned, the Holocaust, pogroms in the USSR, Spanish Inquisition, etc., etc. But the climate crisis, for those of us who aren't on the front lines, can feel very remote and very distant. And because of this isolationist identity or mindset that we adopt when it comes to the climate crisis, we often disassociate ourselves from the problem and shut down, either because we think it's too big to solve or because it's not, a problem that we encounter and therefore it's not a problem at all. And so I think there's a difference to be acknowledged there. But as you guys have been saying, the climate crisis, even though not all of us experience its worst effects currently, is evolving at a rapid pace, and it will, the natural disasters will become more and more catastrophic, unfortunately, if we don't act. And so it will soon become less remote and less distant. And I think we as the Jewish community have to recognize that impending doom and act now as opposed to act reactively. And I was wondering, do you guys have any comments about that? How do we congregate as synagogues, as JCCs, as federations, as youth groups, as the entire Jewish community as a whole to act?
We have to start. Oops, come on, I'm in. I think I don't know what goes on in rabbinic school. I don't know what is being taught in terms of how to address this existential threat that we are so much, it's ingrained in the religion. I don't know if that's. I mean, it seems like that we should be training rabbis to be always addressing this as part of, everything we do, every holiday, every building and so on, and modeling it for parishioners. And it's really, I don't really understand why it seems so separate in so many cases. And I would say firsthand, it's just, it makes no sense to me. And I just watched a webinar. I don't know if it was Zoom or a webinar at a synagogue that I felt the rabbi was very informed and very involved in all these issues. And she had two speakers and they both had plastic water bottles on the bima. And I addressed it. She didn't answer me and she has not answered me before, but I got well, we're working on it. We don't have them during services anymore. I mean, how, we got a problem here. And if that's not something that we can, work, it just doesn't seem like it would be that difficult. And we can't even do the easy things. That's really what frustrates me. That a lot of things are easy and we could make a difference.
Yeah. Have you guys heard the term carbon footprint before?
Of course.
Of course, yes.
Of course.
This is something we talk a lot about within the movement at JYCM. And we actually talk about it in different contexts than you might assume. So carbon footprint was actually not a concept that was initiated by the climate organizing community. It was initiated by the industries, typically fossil fuel industries, that were perpetuating the crisis, interestingly enough. So the idea of tracking your use of water bottles and your showering and your driving, it's useful because obviously that has an effect, however minimal, with each individual. But what the Jewish community according to JYCM's values, should strive to do is organize and mobilize beyond, just the water bottle. So I think the point you're making is very valuable, right? It's so disappointing to see someone actively avoiding or acting discordantly with the crisis at hand. But at the same time, we need such fundamental, instrumental, institutional change that is perhaps more serious than the carbon footprint that we have been fed by the industries perpetuating the crisis.
Sorry,
Was it?
careful, kids aren't coming.
They're not.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's gonna be so disappointing.
You're saying, and I think that's really valuable, that yeah, of course we should do what we can, in our own institution, things like that. But the bigger fish are the things we've really got to concentrate on too. We've got to really change this dependence on fossil fuel, which is a national and international issue, not how much I drive.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
that is definitely something we focus on. And again, thank you everyone for sharing. We have limited time, I'm aware, so maybe we should. Jay, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you're gonna, motivate and persuade a certain number of individuals out there. But even if you motivate and persuade everybody who's willing to listen, it's unfortunately not going to change, I think, the overall trajectory enough. And so, the idea of, climate footprint, fossil fuel companies putting the onus on the individual to be responsible for the trajectory of the climate is just an artificial, inaccurate, and incorrect assessment. It has to be those most responsible, the fossil fuel companies, the banks that enable them, the governments that are paid for, and that's where the change has to happen. It shouldn't be that, well, of course I drive, so I use gas. It should be, well, I have to drive, but my car now is going to be electric because policies are in place to make that a better choice. Or I'm going to use electricity. I'm cold. I like my thermostat where it is, but the energy for that's not going to come from natural gas anymore. It's going to come from clean electricity, whether I know about it or not. So things at the higher levels are where focus has to be.
Yeah, precisely. And that's definitely what we're trying to concentrate on, because it's very easy to slip into, oh, let's all stop driving, let's all stop showering mindset, but it's not going to be effective in the long term because it is individual and it is microscopic on a grand scale. And instead, collective action, systemic action that changes the systems that are painting this image of individual responsibility and individual culpability to make themselves feel less guilty, basically erasing that image and changing those systems. So yeah, very good point. And I want to give us time. Oh yeah, were you going to say something?
I think that from what I understand from most organizations, that we need every branch of this. We can't just do one of these things. And I don't think that turning off the water when you brush your teeth is going to change things. But I think we will have to change our way of life, as well as have the legislative and those kinds of changes. And I do want to add that besides fossil fuel, we are destroying habitat and deforestation. And I feel like that's gotten left out of this mix recently. And I think it's critical, the forests that we're destroying. I mean, it's 30% of the CO2 is being non-sequestered. It's just a terrible problem. It's really equal to that.
Yes, and there are so many different strands of the climate crisis: food systems, deforestation, the vehicle.
Right.
So much to address.
Farm food.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, we need everything.
Yeah. And I want to encourage you guys to reflect on all of those different strands and give you about 7 minutes before we wrap up to write about them, to tell your own Jewish climate narrative. So, right, we've been discussing the predicaments and the potential solutions to those predicaments. And now I encourage you to write your own story. How do you fit into those problems and those solutions? So for me, I would say something along the lines of, oh, I observed this natural disaster, and that natural disaster compelled me to act, and that act translated to my work for the Jewish Youth Climate Movement. So sort of this character arc for yourself, right? What did you observe? How did that inspire a call to action? And what are you going to do in the future? And once you've written this, I can tell you a little bit about what you can do by supporting the Jewish Youth Climate Movement.
So we're supposed to write. All right.
I'm thinking.
Yeah, feel free to get a writing utensil and paper, or if you want to write on your laptop, that's fine as well. And if you want to turn off your camera, that's fine as well. Okay, welcome back. I hope you all had a chance to jot some notes down or get a story flowing. Does anybody want to quickly share a sentence or two? If not, that's okay as well. Thoughts can still be percolating. We only had 7 minutes, so. Oh, wow. Rabbi, do you want to read this aloud?
No, I don't actually, but I didn't have anything to write on but the chat. So I just wrote kind of stream of consciousness there, and it went in a lot of different directions. But it started with childhood and the bad water in Florida, and ended up with Joe Manchin and a false dichotomy that we seem to have created.
Yeah, I've just read a few sentences, but it's very beautiful. So
I don't know. It's very much stream of consciousness. So I wouldn't want it published really anywhere.
Streams of consciousness can be beautiful, and
Yeah.
this is so. Thank you for putting it in the chat, and thank you everyone for participating in this activity. So I'll just say thank you again, and quickly I can share a bit about GYCM. So GYCM has a very robust national leadership board of about 39, 37 members, I want to say. But the bread and butter of our movement is definitely our Kvutsot, which is the term we use for our local chapters. We have approximately 40, I think now, one in Canada and then the rest in the States. I believe there's one in Chicago, so not too far from you. But I would love for you in your individual synagogues to create your own Kvutsot, and there is a process for this, and I can put you in contact with our Kivutza director and our Kivutza intern and the entire team to help you create this community of youth. So it will typically be middle school and high school students who meet regularly to educate each other and the institutions that they're a part of. Typically, a Kivutza will be housed in a synagogue or a youth group or a JCC or a school, and it will congregate the Jewish teens in that institution to put on educational programs and also to take actions to go out and to protest. So I think it was Jay that mentioned that there is this campaign of Pesach actions coming up. I know there's one in Newark, which is near where I live, that I'll be going to, and I hear one in the Chicago area. So I invite you to attend that and to inspire Kavutza perhaps from that occasion. And if you're not capable of supporting a Kivutza, you can also sign on to our commitments, our Shemitah commitments. There are 7 of them, and they're along the lines of I will inspire X amount of students to give X amount of Divrei Torah. I will do X, Y, Z in order to combat the climate crisis. So if you're not ready to support an entire Kivutza, you can also sign on to those commitments. And lastly, our Pesach actions. So try to make it to one of those if you're able to. I know they will be a very inspirational experience in terms of combating the crisis through a Jewish lens with Jewish values in mind, and values that, as we mentioned, extend beyond just repairing the world and tikkun olam, but to taking into account our entire Jewish history of survival and of tradition. So you can also follow our social media if you're on social media. I can put those in the chat, and you can also email us with ideas if you have any for future programming like this or actions that you want us to support you in putting on. And that's all I have. Thank you so much for coming to this session. I hope you enjoyed and that you learned a little that you can take back with you to synagogue and to your Jewish communities. And thank you again for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Wonderful.
I just think you're extraordinary. I think the organization is extraordinary. So I hope that we can inspire some people to be a part of it.
Wonderful. And we can send a follow-up email with more information about Kavutza if that's something you're interested in.